Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning, depending on where you're joining us from today. And if you're like me, you're likely joining us from the comforts of your own home. My name is Samir Varma. I'm a partner in Thompson Hines International Trade Practice, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar. I'm delighted to introduce my colleagues that will be presenting with me today: Francesca Guerrero, partner in our International Trade Group, and Brent Senior Counsel in our Transportation Group. Before beginning, I would like to wish everyone good health and hope you all are safe and well in what is obviously a different and challenging time for everyone. So as we begin, please note the following housekeeping items. Today's program is being recorded, and we will send a link to all attendees within 48 hours of today's presentation. And from now until 1 o'clock, we will be discussing the impact that COVID-19 is having on international trade. All attendees are in listen-only mode, so if you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to use the question box located in the control panel on the right side of your screen to submit any questions. We will answer as many of the questions as we can at the end of the webinar, and will continue to remain online until 1:15. Note that we will be offering CLE credit for today's webinar. Please be sure to fill out and return the webinar affirmation form that can be found in the handout section of the control panel located on the right-hand side of your screen. The form provides instructions as to where to send the completed form. I will announce the tracking code at the end of the program. Note that in that handout panel, you can also download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and bios of today's speakers. So again, thank you for your interest. We'll now begin the webinar. We have a number of topics that we would like to discuss today, which are sort of a hodgepodge of different government initiatives within trade that have been impacted by COVID-19, including export restrictions, government procurement, imports and tariffs, and the Ex-Im Bank. We'll tie it in, all together towards the end of the webinar with a section on planning for the next 12 months. As I mentioned previously, we'll end the webinar with a question and answer session. And now I'd like to turn it over to Francesca, who will start with our first topic, which is export restrictions. Francesca, are you there?
Oh, apologies. I think I didn't get myself off mute. Thank you very much, Samir. The first topic that we'd like to cover in terms of export restrictions is on the U.S. Side. Can you move to the next slide? So as you all may be aware, in early April, FEMA issued a temporary rule under the Defense Production Act, which Brent will discuss in more detail later. The temporary rule, temporarily, meaning through the end of the summer, they will be detaining shipments of certain PPE at the border until FEMA determines whether to return the shipment for domestic use, meaning in the U.S. market, issue a rated order under the DPA, so that means essentially requisition the items for the government, or allow the export or part of all of the shipment. Next slide, please. The PPE that is covered is a relatively limited set. It includes N95 respirators. It includes other respirators, and respirators are different from face masks. It includes various surgical masks that have a fluid barrier, and it includes gloves or surgical gloves. So notably, it doesn't include some items that are covered under other country export restrictions like bleach, sanitation, chemicals, hand sanitizer, etc. And importantly, it doesn't include face masks that are of the type people are wearing on the street right now or using for industrial purposes at manufacturing plants. However, if you are shipping some of these face masks that are meant to be a physical barrier to, say, your overseas manufacturing location, we wanted to note that it's possible these can still be held up by FEMA because the Schedule B classification might be the same as one of the covered PPE. So we have a little pro tip for you on the next slide, where we will talk about exemptions, and then there's a process in place for sort of describing your shipment to Customs and FEMA to get it cleared more quickly. We would recommend that you consider sort of proactively describing and submitting a letter with your export that says it's not one of these covered PPE items and is this other item. If you are shipping, that's something that might be caught. So as I mentioned, there are some exemptions under the temporary rule. The first exemption when it was issued was very narrow, but FEMA relatively quickly issued additional guidance that exempted shipments to the territories, shipments for donation, and I think the one I've heard the most about, the intercompany transfers by U.S. companies. I know there are a number of companies who have some stash of PPE that they want to send to their overseas labs, manufacturing facilities, offices, etc. And so that is as well exempt. Next slide, please. Can you go? Yeah, yes, thanks. And then there are a number of other exemptions, which I won't go through in detail, but I will flag, shipments with a final destination of Canada or Mexico. So, that doesn't mean send it to Mexico for them to send it onward someplace else. That might get you in trouble with the government. But for final, destination of Canada or Mexico. Also, items that have been in a bonded warehouse or a foreign trade zone, both of those can be shipped as an exemption. Next slide, please. So since there are now all of these exemptions, if your company is looking to export PPE and it fits under one of these exemptions, which frankly I think most exports from the United States do, because I do not think that most of the production of these items is currently happening in the United States. What you need to do is look at the procedures for the exemption, and for many of them, you will need to include a letter of attestation that describes what it is and the purpose and basically why you fit under the exemption. I flagged earlier that if you have something that actually shouldn't fall under the rule at all, but you want to make sure it's quickly clear and it doesn't get caught up in confusion, you can also consider a letter of attestation. If it doesn't fall under that those exemptions, FEMA will still review the export, and it's possible that it will be released for export, or again, it might be detained for government use. Okay, next slide, please. There are also a number of export restrictions in place globally, and they're all different. We have been keeping track of the export restrictions in a few key countries, about 30 of them, in a chart that we've been preparing and updating weekly with a number of foreign firms. You can find it on the Trump and Trade blog. But as you can see from this diagram from Bloomberg, a number of countries have placed either bans or, as they call it in the U.S., a de facto export ban because there's this FEMA rule that halts shipments. But it's a wide variety of items. I mean, in some places it's respirators, in some places it's ventilators, in some places it's hand sanitizer. So on the next slide, we'll just show you a little flavor of that. So as an example, in Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union, there's a restriction on a lot of disinfectants and sanitizers and other similar products, as well as like surgical gloves, until September 30th. EU has a temporary export licensing requirement, so it's not a ban exactly, for a number of PPE items, mostly of the ventilator and respirator sort. And China has, of course, its own unique version where they require a certification that the products have been duly registered in China and meet the country's quality standards. So it's not exactly an export ban, but it does, allow them to keep a close eye on what's being exported from China in the PPE space. Next slide. We've seen a number of international organizations kind of pushing back on these export restrictions and keeping them, I think they have had an impact in keeping them as narrow as possible. WTO has been urging transparency, to explain why these restrictions are in place, and it's being asking people to be very specific what they are and make them temporary. Similarly, the G20, and as we'll discuss in a bit, there's you can see the tension between wanting to be protectionist and secure your own supply chain, and the understanding among countries around the world that many countries aren't going to be able to have PPE to protect if the global supply chains don't stay open and all of the different components and transfer, doesn't stay in place. So that is a tension. Next slide, please. Another quick item we will note is that of all of the export licensing agencies, I think BDTC has been the most transparent about the steps that they are taking to make it easier to, keep your exports in place and registrations in place and sort of just ease the workload for people affected by COVID-19. So they've done automatic extensions of registrations for manufacturers and exporters through June 30th. It's a 2-month extension. They've also done a 6-month extension through May 31st of licenses that were in place. Also, and this will tie into a working from home issue we want to discuss a little bit more later, but they have issued some guidance that now allows contractors who previously had to be working at a location to be considered a regular employee, even if they're working at home. And it has allowed regular employees to send and receive technical data from their location, even if their country is not covered by a current TAA or other export licensing authorization, except for if they're working from home in Russia or Cuba or North Korea or China. So that, I think, has been helpful for companies who are in the defense space and have contractors working globally. The other agencies have not, to my knowledge, issued guidance or measures such as this, but I'm sure they are all open to discussion about extensions and licensing requirements to enable workforce to work from home. Next slide, please. Okay, and thank you very much. We're going to turn this over to my colleague Brent to discuss some government procurement initiatives.
Okay, thanks, Francesca. So next we're going to talk about some procurement issues and where they intersect with international trade matters. And of course, this is all going to be within the context of the pandemic. The first item is this GSA waiver of the Buy American Act and the Trade Agreement Act requirements. So you're probably aware of the Buy American Act, which requires a preference for US items in government procurement. And many of you have probably heard about the Trade Agreements Act as well, which waives the Buy American Act or the domestic sourcing requirements in certain acquisitions for items that originate from countries who have signed a free trade agreement with the United States. So the most common example of this is for signatories to the WTO's Government Procurement Agreement, or GPA. So that just means that companies from those countries that have signed the GPA can participate in procurements conducted by other countries that have signed the GPA, and their products are given preferential treatment, and they're treated as if they're a domestic product. Also, even if a country isn't a signatory, I just want to say, to the GPA, I've been using that as an example, their products would still be given a preference if they're a signatory to another free trade agreement with the United States. So, there's CAFTA and NAFTA, there's a US-Israel free trade agreement, and we have one with Oman and other countries. So goods from those countries would be covered under the specific provisions of those free trade agreements. So if the items you want to propose come from a country that isn't a signatory to an FTA, then those items are not going to get preferential treatment. So that's, in a nutshell, how the Buy American Act and where applicable, the Trade Agreement Act work. But both the Buy American Act and the Trade Agreement Act contain certain exceptions. So, for example, the Buy American statute won't apply for items that are end items or components that are mined or produced in the United States if they're not produced in sufficient and reasonably available commercial quantities and of a satisfactory quality. So if they're not available in the numbers that we need or of a quality that we need, then you can get a waiver, or they're covered by an exception in the Buy American Act and the Trade Agreement Act statutes. So in fact, there's a list in the FAR, in the Federal Acquisition Regulations, of items for which non-availability determinations have already been made, and that's at FAR Part 25, Section 401, and those determinations were made under class determination provisions in the FAR. So this means that the waiver applies to all procurements for all of those items on the list. But just as an FYI, there are also individual non-availability determinations that can be made concerning a particular item for a particular acquisition. Not all waivers are class waivers. But recently, the GSA issued a class waiver. It occurred on April 3rd, and it temporarily waives applicability of the Buy American Act and the Trade Agreement Act to acquisitions of PPE and cleansers and disinfectants. And I'll put up a list, or Samir will put up a list in a couple minutes on the exact items. But this determination specifically states that GSA finds certain supplies are unavailable in sufficient quantity and satisfactory quality. So it mirrors the language that's in the Buy American Act statute and the Trade Agreement Act statute. Samir, we can go to the next slide. Thanks. And it goes on to state, the determination does, that these materials can be procured even though they're not from a designated country or the United States, and even though they do not meet the Buy American statute requirements. And just by the way, designated country is shorthand for a country that has a free trade agreement with the United States. So we'll go to the next slide now. Here's a list of all of the items. So you can see there's the N95 masks, bleach, certain cleaners and disinfectants, hand sanitizers, soaps, and dispensers. So we can go to the next slide now. So the reason this is significant is that a GSA non-availability determination impacts GSA's multiple award schedule contracts, which are also referred to as federal supply schedule contracts. It also applies to GSA individual procurements, but the immediate impact here is these existing federal supply schedule contracts. So these are contracts that have been awarded with approved pricing for thousands of suppliers that cover thousands and thousands of items, everything from office supplies to tools, computers, software, construction goods, and of course, medical supplies. And GSA, as well as other executive agencies, can order off of these schedule contracts. So now with the class waiver, any contractor that has a federal supply schedule contract in place can sell these foregoing, the items that were on that chart to the government without complying with the Buy American Act or the Trade Agreements Act. And where suppliers often run into trouble in complying with Buy American and Trade Agreement Act is sourcing items from China and India, two major global suppliers, but neither of those countries are signatory at this time to the WTO's GPA or another free trade agreement, which would get them the preferential treatment in US government procurement. So what this GSA waiver means is that suppliers under the GSA federal supply schedule contracts can now sell the items on the list, even if they're products of China or India or some other country that doesn't get preference under the TAA. But there are some limitations. Remember, I said this is temporary. So unless it's extended, the waiver is only in place through July 1st. The covered items can come from any country except the usual sanctioned countries. So of course that means North Korea, Cuba, Iran, Sudan. In the FAR, Burma still applies on the list of sanctioned countries. They haven't updated it to include the Crimea region, so be aware of that. And I would caution folks if they're looking at supplies from Syria, just because there are so many restrictions with regard to trade with Syria as well. So from a practical perspective, Syria might as well be added to that list. In addition, only the items that are on the list are subject to the waiver. So make sure you're not venturing off that list. And you really should be a current supply schedule contractor to benefit from the waiver, because GSAs, they've expressed a preference to use the current GSA schedule contracts and to modify the existing contracts. And we can go to the next slide, Samir, as well. Thanks. And you should also, if you are one of those supply schedule contract holders, you need to confirm the scope of the waiver with your contracting officer before adding any non-compliant goods, just to make sure that your CO is up to speed on this and on the same page with you. And then contract holders should also disclose the country of origin and cite the waiver when adding the non-compliant items to the contract, so that your purchaser understands the terms and the waiver, et cetera, because the last thing you want is to be accused of trying to pass something off as Buy American compliant or trade agreement compliant, and then being, accused of a false statement and running into, allegations of and assess penalties under the False Claims Act. So make sure that you get a modification to your contract, you get things in writing, you're stating where your items are coming from, and everybody understands and is on board with you. And you also should confirm your sources as well and make sure that they're reliable and legitimate and trustworthy, and that they're meeting all of the federal standards for bringing these goods into the U.S., especially the FDA standards. Next slide, please. All right, next I'm going to cover the Defense Production Act. So this has been in the news in March and April. This is the act that allows the president to shape the domestic industrial base for national defense preparedness. If you're a government contractor, you've dealt with this, you've dealt with rated orders, you know what it is, but typically you've done it in the context of submitting a proposal to a solicitation where you're on notice that the orders are going to be rated and subject to the allocation and prioritization process. But lately in the news, we've seen that the president has used DPA authority to order ventilators, for example, from certain companies. We've also seen that masks were ordered. There was a little bit of a dust-up that we saw in the press with regard to 3M and masks going to Canada, tweets from the president, et cetera. That issue got worked out. Now there's a commitment from both sides, both the U.S., the government, the federal government, and 3M for production and a commitment to purchase going forward. But essentially, there are three powers under the DPA: prioritization, allocation, and incentives. So first, the DPA authorizes the president to require businesses to accept and prioritize contracts for materials and services that are necessary for national preparedness. And then second, the DPA allows the president to allocate materials, and I'll get into a specific order where that's happened as well. The president can order the domestic industrial base to increase production and supply of specially designated, scarce or critical materials, and we've seen that happen. And the president can also use the authorities to prohibit hoarding and price gouging of scarce or critical materials. And this is important because if anybody's stockpiling, to get ready for the next wave, which we've heard about, you probably should take a look at the HHS Federal Register notice and make sure that you understand what they're outlining, and what constitutes hoarding and price gouging, so you don't get, in the crosshairs of that notice and any prohibitions under the DPA. But back to the DPA authorizations, the third authorization supports the prioritization and allocation efforts in that it authorizes the president to provide incentives, and these come in the form of loans, loan guarantees, and purchase commitments, like the one that the federal government made to 3M to purchase, I think it was 55 million masks over the next few months. So next slide, please. So with regard to the DPA and COVID-19, President has issued a number of executive orders and memoranda and statements, and I've selected two to discuss briefly. One came out in March, and then there was another one, and they kind of dovetail with what Francesca was covering earlier. The one that came out in March states that health and medical resources, including PPE and ventilators, are going to meet the criteria of critical and strategic materials under the DPA. So this set the stage for orders to be placed with regard to those materials. And then in early April, the White House issued this memo on allocating certain scarce or threatened health and medical resources to domestic use. And this statement authorized DHS through FEMA to use DPA authority to allocate to domestic use those scarce materials that Francesca covered. So as a result of that memo, DHS, again acting through FEMA, had got the authority to allocate those items to domestic use, and this essentially imposed, I don't know, an export control really on those items. Let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So, so one of the impacts of these orders is that they start to mirror other countries' export restrictions. And of course, some experts say that these measures can backfire if other countries retaliate. And of course, the net effect is going to be that all of these items are just going to become more scarce for everybody. Next slide. All right, in terms of enforcement, violations of the DPA are actually less harsh financially than under the Export Control Reform Act. But one thing to keep in mind is that all of the DPA penalties are considered criminal penalties. So in terms of the violations or the actual penalties, a violation of the DPA can result in a fine of $10,000 per violation, which isn't that much compared to the export control violations, which can be in the 300,000 range per violation. But you could also be punished in terms of imprisonment for up to 1 year. So that really gets people to sit up and notice and comply essentially with DPA. All right, we're going to move on to the next topic now, which of course is this the draft Buy American executive order that's been floating around. So based on earlier reports we've seen, the Buy American executive order would bring pharmaceutical and medical supply production back to the United States. And this does seem to be in contrast to what I was just talking about earlier with what the GSA has done in adopting a class waiver for some medical supplies. So for those of us who are keeping track of the actions coming out of the federal government, you know, we were kind of just scratching our heads trying to piece all of this together. But what I think is going on here is that the GSA waiver is really a reflection of what is needed immediately from a practical perspective versus this Buy American executive order that's still in draft form and hasn't been issued yet. But I think that reflects what a policymaker, say, in the White House is trying to achieve long term. And we're also seeing, you know, this is a prime example of this protectionism versus free trade and relaxation of trade restraints, which Francesca mentioned earlier. And when you look across the board at what's happening in trade in all kinds of different contexts, you keep seeing that tension between protectionism and free trade, which is kind of interesting. Anyway, back to the Buy American executive order. It was reported that the order was on track to be signed, but then the National Security Council raised some legal questions. And then there was opposition from pharmaceutical industry groups and patient advocacy organizations. And they were claiming that bringing all manufacturing back to the United States really overestimated the potential feasibility of actually doing that and underestimated the effort that it would actually take to make these changes. And these groups also claim that a diverse pharmaceutical supply chain is precisely what enables the industry to respond quickly and make adjustments in its supply chain sourcing during these kinds of emergencies and health crises. And then there were other trade concerns, right? So for example, the order would place new requirements on US government agencies in their procurements. So DOD, Veterans Affairs Administration, other agencies would have to buy domestically. And some claim that this would spark a trade war over government procurement access, and that would be in violation of the WTO's government procurement agreement, which I talked about earlier. Also, you know, most Buy American laws or domestic sourcing laws allow waivers if you're procuring a US-made product and it's too expensive, or if the item is not available, right, in sufficient quantities or of a satisfactory quality. We saw that exception earlier. But it's been reported that the current White House draft does away with those waivers, which also eliminates flexibility that the United States might require in difficult times, such as now when there's a pandemic. So it's just something to keep on our radar and to see if the White House will actually go through with issuing the order. Oh, sorry, Samir, I forgot to mention advancing the slides. Thanks for catching up. But I will stop there. And Samir, I'll turn it over to you. I think you're going to cover some of the imports and tariff issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Brent. Yeah, as we continue along this sort of survey of trade initiatives, I'm going to focus this next portion of the presentation on imports and tariffs. I mean, obviously, supply chains all over the world have been greatly impacted by COVID-19, and it's you know, it's having a profound effect on how companies are importing the products. And I think one of the major issues is basically this China issue. I think we can all agree that the U.S. government already has what can be best be described as a topsy-turvy relationship with China over the last few years. The fact that China is a major producer of COVID-19 related medical items only adds to this tension, and how the U.S. government has and will respond to the fact that many companies are looking to China and their supply of medical products is still of great interest. Furthermore, there's been transportation delays related to air and cargo shipments, which is impacting the supply chain greatly. Transportation and logistic companies are facing a lot of order cancellations by customers. Shippers have increasingly emphasized the transportation of medical supplies, including essential food, PPE, medical, pharmaceutical supplies over other items. I mean, while obviously this is necessary, it has had an interesting impact on the import of non-COVID-19 related items, causing delays throughout the supply chain. Another interesting aspect of this all is the stay-at-home orders globally, and the varying definitions of essential businesses. What qualifies as an essential business is not the same in one country as the next. So companies in the U.S. who are deemed essential, who are looking at suppliers for needed inputs, are not always obtaining what they need from their non-U.S. suppliers. I think just yesterday it was reported that a bipartisan group of senators urged the Trump administration to press Mexico to change its definition of essential business. I guess the definition in Mexico right now does not include certain industries needed for the production of food, medical, and other what's considered critical goods. It has led to shutdowns of factories in Mexico, hundreds of factories all over Mexico tied to these industries. And so you can imagine what this means for U.S. companies relying on their suppliers from Mexico. Finally, as we've been discussing, the U.S. government as well as non-U.S. governments have placed numerous restrictions on exports, but they've also placed numerous restrictions on imports, and particularly COVID-19 related items. There have been numerous delays reported at CBP and other customs organizations internationally due to special measures being enforced related to safety and health concerns, as well as special customs clearances of COVID-19 related items causing delays in the release of other items. And so obviously this COVID-19 has had a profound impact on the way we do business and the way we import products. So I'll start off with imports of PPE, and U.S. government agencies have responded in numerous ways to the need for personal protective equipment and other COVID-19 related items. This does bring up an interesting issue with the interplay between all of these different agencies, and companies who are importing PPE or other products have to navigate all these different agencies. We've already talked about FEMA, but there's CBP, and there's Customs and Border Protection, Food and Drug Administration, and the U.S. International Trade Commission. Companies have to navigate all of these different areas to make sure that they're compliant with the various regulations. In order to help with the imports, CBP has established the COVID-19 Cargo Resolution Team. This team is tasked with coordinating inquiries regarding the import of medical supplies and PPE. They are using the website, the cbp.gov website. It's actually imports.cbp.gov to create a tool to publish answers related to COVID-19 issues, including cargo hold and facilitation assistance, questions related to admissibility and PPE classification, and they've also included guidance related to PPE importing and duties. In addition, the FDA has created a new licensing and enforcement policy to help expedite and ease the importation of PPE. The guidance provides information such as which products are regulated by FDA, which ones are regulated as medical devices, which ones are not, which you can use emergency use authorizations, and related information. This next bullet refers to this bipartisan group, which on April 13th, the bipartisan group headed by House Ways and Means Chairman Richard Neal, who's a Democrat from Massachusetts, and Senate Finance Committee Chairman Chuck Grassley, who's the Republican from Iowa. USITC instituted an investigation in order to provide a report that tries to identify the imports of COVID-19 related products, their source countries, the tariff classifications, the rates of duty. The idea of this is to assist these committees in working to address the coronavirus emergency. The report was actually due today, April 30th. As of right now, I have not seen the report, and so I don't know whether it's actually been issued or whether there's been any delay in that. Finally, I just wanted to quickly touch upon the EU's attempt at coordination. They've launched an accelerated joint procurement procedure with its 26 member states, and it was done in an attempt to sort of understand the production capabilities throughout the EU and increase the supply of PPE to those members who need them the most. Furthermore, as I'll discuss a little bit later, the EU has waived VAT and customs duties on imports of certain items deemed essential goods. So one of the main items that have been impacted is the Section 301 exclusions. I guess just so we're all on the same page here, the Section 301 tariffs refer to the imposition of tariffs on products imported from China that the administration has basically put forward over the last few years through various orders. What's often colloquially referred to as the China tariffs. Now, prior to the outbreak of COVID-19, there were already certain exclusions from these China tariffs that were granted for some medical equipment, such as ventilators, so that they weren't subject to these additional Section 301 duties. But it didn't cover all of the medical devices or medical equipment or COVID-19 related items. So beginning on March 10th, and over the course of about a week and 3 separate orders, USTR began excluding even more items, including gloves, lab equipment, face masks, and others. These exclusions are retroactive to the imposition of their original Section 301 tariffs, so September 1st, 2019, and will run until September 1st, 2020. This is obviously very interesting given the tension between US and China, that they've also, the USTR has also invited input on additional products that are needed to respond to the COVID-19 outbreak. They set up this emergency set of procedures to seek further exclusions. essentially they've opened up a new special exclusion process, which may allow for modification on the list of products that are subject to these Section 301 duties. If people are familiar with the exclusion process before, this new one mirrors the same process that was already in place. This has a couple of different additional items of information that are required. For example, when you submit a comment, you must specifically identify the particular product of concern and explain precisely how the product relates to the response to the COVID-19 outbreak, and similar sort of information. Just to note, the comments are due by June 25th, 2020. In addition, I just read that yesterday the USTR announced that it is considering a 1-year extension on certain previously approved China tariff exclusions, and the comments for that are due June 1st, and will be evaluated sort of on a case-by-case basis rather than an across-the-board extension. Now, this isn't exactly tied to COVID-19, but the timing does suggest that USTR is attempting to sort of alleviate some of the concerns from companies who are struggling in the face of the pandemic. So those comments are due June 1st. It relates to the original first 2 lists of Section 301 exclusions. And by the way, just to cover this all, I mean, PPE, this is the Section 301 exclusions, but PPE may still be subject to regular sort of non-Section 301 duties. For example, face masks some face masks are considered textile items, and they will be assessed at 7%. So this exclusion process only covers the China-related tariff aspect. So even after the USTR's reduction in the 301 tariffs, there was still concern that they had not gone, that the administration, the government had not gone far enough. There's been a lot of back and forth on this. So at one point there was a proposed delay when on March 20th, CBP announced that it would accept requests for temporary deferral of payments of duties and all the related taxes and fees and review them on a case-by-case basis. And there was a lot of pushback from domestic industry over concerns essentially related to China and their potential stockpiling of goods, maybe the influx of cheap goods that are normally subject to other sort of duties, anti-dumping or countervailing duty orders, things like that. And so within a week after March 20th, CBP withdrew this option and it was no longer available for importers. After some back and forth again, on April 18th, the president did sign an executive order announcing a 90-day deferral on certain payments for importers. And this applies from March 1st to today, April 30th. There's sort of 2 big aspects to this. The first is that importers must show that they are experiencing significant financial hardship, which is defined as the importer has basically suspended operations during March or April due to certain government orders from a governmental authority. And as a result, you have to show that your gross receipts from between March 13th and March 31st or in April of 2020 are less than 60% of the gross receipts during that same period in 2019. So year-over-year analysis must be 60%, less than 60% of the gross receipts. What's interesting about this is that CBP indicated you don't need to file additional documentation, so it's not an approval on a case-by-case basis or anything like that, but you still must maintain supporting documents evidencing the financial hardship in case you get audited or something. The government has confirmed that no interest will accrue or penalties be assessed during this 90-day period. However, the duty deferment is only for the normal duties or MFN duties owed. It's not applicable to any additional duties associated with various government orders like the 301 I talked about, or the steel and aluminum cases, or AD/CVD, anti-dumping countervailing duty trade orders, etc. So now this temporary rule is effective as of April 22nd, but Customs has opened up a 30-day comment period. So I just want to briefly touch upon sort of global import measures. I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but I do want you guys to see what other countries are doing and how they're approaching COVID-19 and the impact on their imports. Now, we've read estimates that over 80 countries have eased importation of medical supplies, by duties, taxes, health approval requirements, et cetera. And actually, the World Customs Organization, WCO, maintains a list of tariff classifications of medical supplies, along with a list of countries that have adopted certain import measures, such as the lowering or waiving of direct and indirect duties and taxes on imports. And these next two slides just list a few examples of these import measures, including here is temporary suspensions of taxes, tariffs, and duties. We talked about the EU one, where they've waived VAT and customs duties on imports of certain items listed as essential goods, and obviously US down below. The next slide talks more about the temporary deferrals of taxes, duties, and fees by US and Canada, some expedited import procedures, as well as temporary government procurement of imports. And so I'll let you guys see this more as an example of what other countries are doing and how they're responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. So now I will turn it over to Francesca for a brief discussion on the efforts of Ex-Im Bank.
Thank you, Samir. I think next slide. So we just wanted to briefly touch on this for companies who are not actually terribly familiar with export-import bank financing, to alert you to potentially some sources of financing that might help in the current situation. The Export-Import Bank, their goal is primarily to enable and support U.S. manufacturers in exporting products internationally, and they have, we say here 4 new initiatives. Some of them are pre-existing, but they've expanded it. I'd say they have 4 key programs. One is bridge financing, which is actually more for the foreign importers and to assist them in obtaining financing for the import of U.S. products. They also have pre-export financing for U.S. manufacturers. They have supply chain financing to help, I would say, it's sort of a hybrid of a traditional supply chain financing program with the export-import guarantee. So that's the export-import primarily works through guarantees of financing. But it's sort of a hybrid program there of supply chain financing with the export-import guarantee, and then the capital guarantees, so for working capital. So, I don't want to get into these in great depth, but if obtaining financing to produce and sell and export your products is a problem, I would suggest looking into this, and we're happy to follow up after the call. One thing I should note, we've been spending a lot of time talking about COVID-19 medical related items and the export restrictions, import restrictions, or import mostly easing that's occurred. Ex-Im Bank did issue guidance that for a temporary period of time, their financing would not be available to enable the export of these COVID-19 related medical items. So this is really financing for other products that companies are trying to sell globally. Samir, I think we can move on to the next slide in the discussion of sort of pulling this together and thinking about the next 12 months.
Sure. So, obviously we talked a lot about the current state of exports, government procurement, imports, et cetera. But COVID-19 is obviously going to have a much larger impact. Francesca and Brent both hit upon the fact that the U.S. government and administration may take an even more protectionist approach in trying to sort of restart the economy. And it may lead to more domestic or sort of regional emphasis on the supply chain. What we wanted to do here is talk have a discussion between Francesca, Brent, and I about some of these areas and planning for the next 12 months. So Francesca, do you want to start with supply chain adjustments?
I think actually Brent might see that one up.
Sure.
Yeah, I'll be happy to, make a couple observations with regard to supply chains. Look, right now, a lot of companies, probably just about every U.S. business is experiencing disruption to the supply chain and manufacturing operations. They've had to deal with temporary closures. There's been kind of a triple challenge here because of supply shortages of materials, and then a drop in sales, and then labor might not be available because of state sheltering orders or illnesses or quarantines. And then, you've got cash flow pressure. So, and then on top of that, all of these problems are worsened by past pressure on U.S. business to reduce, supply chain costs. And that was done through lean manufacturing, right? With just-in-time supply deliveries. A lot of processes were offshored and services were outsourced. And so we had a situation where a lot of global companies really didn't know what their risk was going into this. They didn't have any knowledge of any alternative direct suppliers. They knew who their direct suppliers were, but that was about it. There was no knowledge of first and second tier suppliers and where they're located. And so there was really a lack of flexibility and agility. And that's exactly what you need, with these types of situations. So let's look at a couple things that can be done to address these. First, you have to identify your current vulnerabilities. You need to monitor your vulnerabilities, because this is constantly changing. And you need to develop a disruption monitoring program. You need to cover your tier 1 suppliers and below, right? You need a full picture of your suppliers to understand exactly your vulnerabilities. So don't stop with your main suppliers. And you also need to be keyed in with your customers and determine what their current spending and demand habits are. And then open channels of communication with your key customers. And then also you can take a look at your supply agreements as well to see if there's any flexibility. And then if you can, try to build a buffer stock, but again, be wary of the HHS notice and the prohibition against hoarding. And above all, try to diversify your supplier system as well. But of course, there are additional costs with that, because if you engage multiple suppliers in different locations, you're going to lose the economy of scale that you built up with your main supplier. And of course, that's going to drive up costs. But those are a couple of things to address with regard to supply chain disruptions. And then, it may be difficult right now, but you want to start thinking about the rebound, because companies that are resilient and can act, with agility and flexibility, they're going to be able to capture a larger share of the pent-up demand that's out there. And it will help you solidify relationships with important customers, and you might even gain new customers. So those are some considerations in that regard. I don't know if Samir or Francesca have anything to add, but those are, like I say, a few observations.
Sure, I'll throw a couple of things out there, and I do wish we had a poll set up, actually, now that we're discussing it, because as you said, there's a tension between wanting to perhaps try to integrate supply, like vertically integrate supply chains to avoid disruptions, across borders, and a fear that a vertically integrated supply chain might just be totally shut down. I've heard some discussion of regional integration, and if anyone wants to chime in, we won't name any names, but you can log on, you can go into the little question box on the side if you want to share anything about whether your company is looking at perhaps regional integration or vertical integration, or whether they're looking to diversify their supply chain. We'd be curious to hear what trends are out there. And then the next bullet I'll touch on briefly on this slide really speaks to supply chain issues, mostly for PPE and medical equipment and sanitation, in that most of the export restrictions that we talked about do not apply to items that are in bonded warehouses or in free trade zones, or certainly in the U.S. they don't apply to items in foreign trade zones in the U.S. So that is one thing I think companies in that niche market in particular are exploring, whether if they hadn't had a bonded warehouse before, they should consider initiating one, so that over the next year, that might be a place to stash some of this equipment. Samir, any other comments on that one?
No, I think that's absolutely right. I think that it's even on the import side, people are going to be looking at bonded warehouses and free trade zones to potentially stockpile goods and before entering them into the commerce of the United States. And so how we use bonded warehouses and free trade zones is going to be I think it's going to be a new and sort of burgeoning field over the next 12 months and even beyond. As far as the next, as far as the next bullet, go ahead. Want to go ahead, Francesca?
Oh, I was just going to encourage people. We'll be opening this to questions, but they won't be verbal questions. If you have any questions on the presentation, if you can also put those in the question box, we'll keep tabs on those, and then after we finish this part up, we'll start looking at them and answering them.
Thanks, Francesca. Yeah. Just running through these next few bullets. So, export controls, new medical devices created in response to COVID-19. I think, as we move forward in a world that there may be increased reliance on some high technologies to sort of track COVID-19, whether it be contact tracing or temperature or body scanning or even there's stuff like lung capacity scanners and things like that. I do believe that there's going to be some export control implications related to all of these and the new medical devices that are put in place. Companies are going to have to navigate we've talked about navigating all the different agencies. Well, we're going to be adding more agencies to this mix, albeit whether it's Department of Commerce or Department of State or anything else or any other agency related to export controls to ensure that companies are being compliant with those regulations. I think that's a big thing that we'll have to look at over the next 12 months. Francesca, do you want to hit the next bullet?
Sure. Yes, and I talked about technology transfer a little bit earlier when we were talking about the DDTC's actions. But as many of us are aware, there's not only the current period of working from home, but many people anticipate future periods of working from home during this pandemic. And with people working remotely, there's an increased concern about technology transfer restrictions, especially if people are working remotely in different countries. If you have contractors or employees in Europe who might be either working remotely because they have family in a different location than they're normally in, or who are stuck in a location temporarily, can they access the technology that you're developing, that they need to do their work from wherever their location is? And DDTC did issue some loosening of that. I haven't seen the other agencies issue any sort of blanket actions that will make it easier to work from home in that way. So companies should be thinking about whether they need licenses to enable employees to work from locations other than the United States or other than locations where offices might be located. And I'm sure that's something people are already thinking about, cybersecurity, but export controls ties along with it.
Francesca, I think that's right. Sorry. I was just going to say, I think that's right. I agree with what Francesca is saying. And the other thing that comes to mind is we've heard, over the course of this pandemic that the pandemic seems to be exposing, fissures or, cracks in various systems, all kinds of systems. And I think that technology transfer and working from home issues have always been an issue, but now that just about everyone is working from home and dialing into their office and, on various servers from time to time, it's really brought this technology transfer to light. And so if you're used to being in a physical facility where there are firewalls, physical firewalls that protect controlled information, now that we're in a mostly electronic environment, you really have to make sure you're focused on your electronic firewalls. Like when people are dialing into your system, are those firewalls working? Which servers are they going to, and what do they have access to? So this is an area, combined with cybersecurity, as Francesca mentioned, that people really need to be paying attention to.
So Brent, why don't you touch upon foreign investment review, and then we'll hit some of the questions that we're receiving.
Yeah, so the three of us were talking about this earlier, and what comes to mind for me for foreign investment review, of course, is CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which has been in the press, especially the trade press, a lot lately because of recent changes that were adopted, including the addition of mandatory declarations and filings before under CFIUS. For those who are familiar with it, all of the notices were filed on a voluntary basis. You essentially got the government's blessing with regard to foreign investment in a U.S. business. Maybe you had to mitigate, but it would essentially, you would work out a deal with the government and you would get safe harbor so that your investment couldn't be unwound later. But now, with these required filings, certain investments in U.S. businesses that are involved with critical infrastructure, as that's defined in the CFIUS regulations, under certain circumstances, you're now required to file a declaration with the CFIUS committee. And I think that those who are involved with the medical supply industry need to keep an eye out for changes in this area, because I wouldn't be surprised if the medical supply industry was added to the list of industries and the regulations that qualify as critical infrastructure. So keep that on your radar. There may be mandatory filings or declarations applicable for certain investments in U.S. businesses that are involved in that industry. We'll see, but I wouldn't be surprised if that happened.
And Brent, I think, beyond the potential mandatory filing requirements, obviously CFIUS has jurisdiction over any acquisition of control, which is very broadly construed. It certainly doesn't mean 50% investment. So even if they don't make it mandatory, I think that we will see more CFIUS scrutiny of investment in companies that produce medical equipment and isn't particularly high tech, but is part of this infrastructure, medical supply infrastructure.
Yeah, I think you're right. Just because there are now mandatory requirements doesn't mean that, to your point, the voluntary filings have gone away, so that that safe harbor is still available. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if we did see an uptick in that regard.
And I think it's also worth mentioning briefly, I'm sorry, there's just, there's also a bunch of international foreign investment restrictions that are coming into place because of COVID-19 in Europe and some other locations. There are restrictions specifically on investment into the medical supply industry. So, you know, if you're considering investing internationally, keep those in mind as well.
Thanks, Francesca. So we'll start with the question, with some of the questions that are being asked. I do want to note that if you have additional questions or we don't answer a question that you've written during the time, feel free to email or call your current Thompson-Hein contact. They'll direct you to a member of our COVID-19 task force. And if you don't have a current Thompson-Hein contact, please contact one of us so we can discuss with you options to address your needs. The first question, Brent, this is for you, and it asks, do you think there's any chance that other government contracts that have Buy American clauses, et cetera, not related to PPE, will allow a temporary softening in these restrictions? And there may be areas where supply has been impacted as a result of the pandemic and other options. Are there other options, if approved, that could fill the gap?
Yeah, a good question. Look, as more and more items become scarce and there are greater challenges on finding, various supplies, I wouldn't be surprised if there was further relaxation on the Buy American clauses and the requirements. Now, if you've got a current contract, you would probably need a modification to that contract. And of course, you would want it in writing because, you don't want to be accused of passing off a non-compliant item as a compliant item and then getting accused of violating the False Claims Act and dealing with those severe penalties. So to the extent you have an existing contract and there's a domestic sourcing requirement and it is now difficult because of the insufficient quantity standard to procure those items, go to your customer, work with your contracting officer, and there are provisions in the FAR where you provide information on the unavailability, and you probably, if the government needs these items, they probably will modify your contract to allow non-BAA compliant items. But again, it's critical to get everything in writing, and again, make sure your government customer knows exactly where the items are coming from and that you have written approval in that regard. And then with regard to new contracts, if the item that is being sought to be procured or acquired is not available, then when filling out your proposal, you make that known and you request a waiver at the proposal stage. Yeah, good question. I wouldn't be surprised if the relaxation goes further as we confront more and more scarcity situations.
Thanks, Brent. The next question I'll tee up for Francesca. The question is, I didn't see gowns listed in the PPE subject to export restrictions. Are gowns restricted at all?
So great question. I'll just address the U.S. I don't know globally, it might be the case. I have not seen gowns covered by the FEMA order. Now, the FEMA order can be extended to other items. So if I have missed an extension since I last checked it, anyone feel free to chime in and weigh in on this as well. But gowns were not covered in the original list, and I haven't seen an expansion of it to gowns.
Yeah, I haven't seen it either, Francesca. So
yeah, I'll just add real fast that the focus has been mostly on respirators, masks, gloves, etc. But in the HHS notice under the DPA prohibiting hoarding and price gouging, there's a pretty extensive list. It's much more extensive than in other government actions that have been issued or that have come out, and gowns is on that list. So it is on the radar. I guess one thing to keep in mind is that some of these lists under the DPA and under other government actions might be extended. We might see additional items added to them. And in terms of time frames, those time frames might be extended as well. So, you know, we really have to keep an eye on what these, what the statuses of these actions are, and any changes that could be occurring, you know, now and in the future.
So the next question, Francesca, this one's for you. With regard to attestation letters, either for waivers or for goods that are not covered by FEMA PPE restrictions, but might be perceived to be under them, have there been any attestation letters rejected? What is important to include to clear CBP scrutiny?
Sure. So I'm sure there have been some rejected. I've not personally worked on them, so I can't speak to those. I'm sure that there's some that haven't, you know, passed muster. I'll go back to the guidance that FEMA provided, which said that it's important to include a really good description of the exemption that you're claiming. So you need to look at the list of exemptions and be very clear about which one you're claiming. And there may be more than one. So if there's more than one, feel free to include them all. But just, you know, clearly include them all. Then you need to provide details to explain why it falls into the exemption. For example, if you're shipping it to your you know, overseas manufacturing location, it's an intercompany transfer. You need to be clear about where it's going. If there's some sort of middleman that might be receiving it, you need to explain what, you know, what that middleman is going to do to transfer it to your location. You need to perhaps, you know, include something that makes it clear that this is a subsidiary or affiliate. And then there needs to be a certification at the bottom. And so I think that is conceivably, you know, something that people could forget as these templates are being developed. We can help you, you know, prepare a template that includes the certification. But I think those are the key items. And I think that, you know, the important point is just to be clear, provide them enough detail, but still try to be concise and specific so it gets processed quickly.
Thanks, Francesca. And maybe you can answer this last question, and as we're up against time, 30 seconds or so. So what areas of trade do you think pose the highest risk of emphasis by enforcement agencies?
Oh, yes, a good question, Samir. We were talking about this a bit a little while ago. You know, one thing I think we didn't touch on this presentation, but is a high risk that as things are crazy and people are buying stuff from governments for millions of dollars, you know, based on expedited authority and a handshake and a letter, is that the FCPA is still enforced. And anything that companies are trying to do to get their shipments expedited through international customs, those pose high risk, because again, there's just so much loosening of authority for contracting, and so much also broadening of government authority to monitor things. So I think that there's a high FCPA enforcement risk right now.
Agreed. Thanks, Francesca. So that brings us to the close of our program. A quick plug for our Trump and Trade blog. We invite you to visit our blog, trumpandtrade.com. Please sign up to receive timely updates on the Trump administration's international trade activities and policies. Really, we invite you to the Thompson website and register to receive our mailings under the Publications tab. If you are seeking CLE for today's program, the tracking code is TH430. Again, it's TH430. So thank you all for your interest and attending today. Please enjoy the rest of your day and stay well out there. Thanks, everybody.